Everyone knows Alexander the Great, conqueror, God King, the man who wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. But here's what they never put in the textbooks. He was also, at one point, desperate. And the people who held his empire by the throat weren't Persian warriors or Macedonian rivals. They were maritime traders from the archipelago we now call the Philippines. That story got buried. Deliberately or not, it got buried deep. The spice routes of antiquity were not romantic. They were brutal economic highways where fortunes were made and empires collapsed over the price of cloves. And sitting at the eastern end of those highways, long before any European sailor thought to draw a map of Southeast Asia, were the Austronesian seafarers of the Philippine archipelago. They didn't wait to be discovered. They were already moving. Back then, around the 4th century BCE, the Philippine Islands weren't the passive backwater that colonial-era textbooks would later invent. Archaeological evidence from sites like Taban Cave in Palawan and trade deposit findings across the Visayas point to active maritime communities with sophisticated exchange networks. These weren't fishing villages waving at passing ships. These were nodes in a trading web that stretched from the China coast westward through the Malacca Straits and onward toward the Indian subcontinent. And it was from that Indian subcontinent that word traveled west, into Persian networks, into the ears of Greek merchants, eventually into the supply calculations of Alexander's campaign logistics. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Alexander's conquest of Persia and the push eastward. It wasn't purely military glory driving him toward the Indus. It was economics wrapped in the language of destiny. The Greek world was addicted to spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom. These weren't just seasoning. They were medicine, ritual, currency, and status all compressed into a small handful of dried plant matter. Greek physicians prescribed them. Greek priests burned them. Greek aristocrats displayed them. The demand was enormous. The supply was controlled by people very far away. Alexander's eastward march cut through supply chains more than it cut through armies. He wanted access. He wanted to stand at the source. But the source kept moving east, because the spices that made Greek and later Roman mouths water, particularly cloves and nutmeg, didn't come from Persia. They didn't even come from India. Their origin was the Maluku Islands, deep in what is now eastern Indonesia, accessible almost exclusively through Philippine and Malay maritime networks. The Austronesian trading cultures of the Philippine archipelago were the middlemen, the gatekeepers. Let's say the ones who knew the routes, controlled the boats, and set the terms. No Greek ship reached the Maluku Islands, none. The geographic and navigational barrier was total. What Alexander's empire could access was the tail end of the chain. Indian merchants who had purchased from Malay intermediaries who had, in turn, dealt with Philippine Austronesian traders who'd made the deep ocean crossings that Mediterranean sailors couldn't attempt. Every link in that chain had a markup. Every link understood its leverage. And leverage is power, even if no one writes your name in marble. Stop for a moment. Think about what that means. Alexander controlled armies that could crush stone fortresses. He had engineers who built siege towers and rerouted rivers. And yet he could not get a direct line to the people growing the spices his civilization couldn't function without. The Filipino and Malay maritime networks represented something his military genius couldn't conquer: geographic intimacy with an ocean he didn't know existed. The Philippines sits at the center of the Coral Triangle. Its islands fragment into over 7,000 pieces of land, each surrounded by some of the world's most complex and biologically rich waters. For Austronesian sailors, navigating those waters wasn't a feat. It was Tuesday. They'd been doing it for thousands of years before Alexander was born. They read currents the way a scribe reads text. They understood star paths, wind patterns, and seasonal swells with a precision that no Mediterranean sailor could replicate. This wasn't accidental advantage. It was accumulated knowledge across generations, encoded in oral traditions, in boat-building craft, in the specific knowledge of when to sail and when to wait. That knowledge was currency. And the Greek world paid for it, indirectly and expensively, every time it bought spices. Every Roman triumph that burned incense was, in a very real economic sense, a tribute flowing backward through the chain to the maritime peoples of the archipelago. A year after Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire began fracturing. The Diadochi Wars tore apart his generals. The political structure collapsed. But the spice trade didn't pause. It didn't mourn Alexander. It continued flowing through the same channels it had used before his birth and would use for centuries after his death. Because the Philippine and Malay maritime networks weren't built on one ruler's ambition. They were built on something more durable, mutual economic necessity, and generational expertise. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt tried to develop a more direct sea route to spice-producing regions, they were essentially trying to build a shortcut around a system that was already ancient. They made partial progress. They never completed the bypass. The people at the eastern end of the chain remained essential. Now here's the question that nobody seems to ask. If this trade network was so significant, why don't we hear about it? Why isn't there a chapter in Western history books titled "The Philippine Merchants Who Shaped the Ancient Mediterranean"? Think about it. The answer has layers, and none of them are flattering to Western historiography. First, the Philippine Austronesian traders were not writers in the Greek or Roman tradition. Their knowledge was oral, their records were material, goods, boats, routes, relationships. When colonial contact eventually came, those oral traditions were systematically disrupted. The Spanish arrived in 1565 with Bibles and a very specific idea of what civilization looked like. It didn't look like what they found, so they renamed it, rewrote it, or simply didn't record what didn't fit. Second, the intermediary nature of the trade meant that the people with the writing systems, Indian merchants, later Arab traders, eventually Portuguese explorers, wrote about what they encountered directly. You know, they wrote about Malacca, they wrote about Calicut. The Philippine Islands were a step further east, a step beyond the comfortable reach of surviving documentation. Third, and this is where it stings, archaeology in the Philippines was severely underfunded and deprioritized for most of the 20th century. Sites that could have yielded more precise trade chronologies were excavated late, excavated partially, or not excavated at all. The Taban cave findings established deep human habitation, but trade archaeology, the kind that maps exchange networks across centuries, requires sustained institutional commitment that the country's research infrastructure simply didn't receive at the level the evidence deserved. If you want to understand what was genuinely lost, not just overlooked but actively erased in the rewriting of colonial-era history, you need to look at what survived despite everything. The golden artifacts recovered from burial sites across the Philippines. The golden Tara of Agusan, the Laguna copperplate inscription, the jewelry buried with high-status individuals across the Visayas. These tell a story of a culture deeply connected to international exchange networks. The Laguna copperplate, dated 900 CE, is written in a script with Sanskrit influence and references political relationships spanning multiple polities. This is not primitive. This is a literate, networked, legally sophisticated civilization that had been developing for a very long time before that document was written. Which means the centuries before it were not silence. They were simply unrecorded by people whose records survived. Go further back. The Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan, which linguistic and genetic evidence dates to approximately 3000 to 2000 BCE, moved south through the Philippine archipelago. The people who became the Filipino maritime trading cultures were already sailing the Western Pacific, while the Greeks were still arguing about geometry. By the time Alexander was pushing his armies toward the Indus, Philippine sailors had been crossing deep ocean for 2,000 years. 2,000 years of practice. That's not a supporting character in someone else's story. That's the main event of a different story, and one that Western historical frameworks simply weren't built to tell. The twist, though, is this. Alexander's legacy, the Hellenistic world, the spread of Greek culture, the eventual fusion with Roman civilization. All of it depended on the spice trade to remain economically viable. Historians have documented how the Roman economy in its peak centuries was deeply intertwined with luxury goods flowing from Asia. The demand for spices helped fund Roman infrastructure. The search for direct spice routes eventually motivated Vasco da Gama's voyage. That voyage connected the dots toward Ferdinand Magellan's expedition. And Magellan's expedition is where the Philippines formally entered the written record of Western history. In 1521, Magellan arrived in the Philippine archipelago. He was looking for spices. He was, in the long arc of this story, the distant consequence of a hunger that Alexander's empire had helped amplify 17 centuries earlier. He arrived. He encountered sophisticated polities with their own laws, their own trade networks, their own political disputes. And in Matan, Lapu-Lapu's warriors resisted him. The people Alexander's civilization had indirectly depended on for centuries, the people whose ancestors had shaped the economics of the ancient Mediterranean, without ever appearing in its texts. Those people stopped a European expedition at the water's edge. And the spices kept flowing, because they always had. But there's a detail. The real history of the Philippines in antiquity isn't a footnote to Alexander's story. Alexander is a footnote to theirs. His empire rose, peaked, shattered, and disappeared into the rubble of the Hellenistic world. The maritime networks of the Philippine archipelago continued operating. Adapted, survived. Connected east and west for millennia before anyone in Athens thought to wonder where the cloves came from. They came from people who knew the ocean like a language. Important, and they never needed Alexander's permission to speak it.